I'm Ed Crawford with Chevron, and the question I have is, and appears to be a challenge in the industry, as wireless becomes more and more pervasive. Sometimes we tend to think that we're the only ones putting wireless devices in the airwave space in our area. So how do you manage the wireless space when multiple disciplines want to use it, and you've installed something and it works great, and then you notice something is starting to degrade, and you find out another group like the physical security group put in wireless CCTV?
Well, go ahead. Dave raised his hand first. We'll give everybody a shot at that.
Well, you're spot on. So RF, the spectrum is a real estate issue, just like the physical land, and there has to be governance on that. Just like if the security guys wanted to build a shed, their guard shack right where you want to put your dock, you have the same issue. So when you think of it in those terms, you really need some sort of governance of that scarcity, and make sure that that the most leveraging use of that real estate is in fact being conducted.
Yeah, completely agree. It's really important to get to a level that in your organization where it's a multidisciplinary decision-making point. Otherwise, you do run into issues of having people stepping on each other's toes, and even though it's an unlicensed band, it's not free, right? I mean, it's your application, and somebody's stepping on your applications, it becomes problematic. So what we've done together with BASF and with other companies, including companies like Chevron, is to actually come out with a plan, a strategic plan. You heard Chris talk about, let's figure out what the long-term plan is, where do we want to get to, make sure that those are captured and then communicated, and it has to be bought in with the various disciplines that are going to get impacted by that plan. And if you don't do that up front, you potentially get into trouble.
Just a comment I would make on that. We've had, as I mentioned, there's really predominant or very pervasive wireless networking in the discrete manufacturing world, and they don't have many times the kind of space that we may have in process manufacturing. The one presentation at the forum that we have back in the history is from Boeing, where they had something like 6,000 access points in a particular factory, and the way that the gentleman from Boeing described their operations is that we have an internal FCC. Just as you were saying, everybody has a bunch of applications. We have to not just share the spectrum, but we also have to prioritize those applications in terms of what kind of performance they're going to get.
Yeah, when we put it in there, I've given this presentation before, it's kind of a field of dreams. If you build it, they will come. And as soon as we got that wireless infrastructure in there, we had people jumping in pretty quickly. And what we found is first of all, we had to have a way of prioritizing it, but we also put it at our site under one particular individual who's approving all of those, so that we have somebody that's prioritizing it. Of course, there's difficult conversations that come out of that sometimes, but you've got to prioritize it, because they'll jump in and put video out there monitoring everything out in the unit that they don't have to climb a set of stairs now to go look at. So you have to really control that.
So I'll add one thing to that. In the manufacturing industry, you have inside the battery limits, or inside a facility. In the upstream world, there's also a challenge. You think, well, it's wide open. But we had a place where we installed something in a field, and the adjacent field was leased from another company, and they later put in something in the same frequency, and we noted degradation. And so you have digital neighbors that you have to consider. So that becomes a real challenge.
Along those same lines, just because you have licensed spectrum doesn't mean that the problem goes away. So your whole wireless strategy should look for those how do you handle those kinds of interference issues?
Can you elaborate on that a little more? Because that surprises me. That's the reason that I've always heard people say they went to licensed spectrum, is so they don't have to worry.
Well, there was situation at the Whiting plant where they had licensed spectrum. That this happened to be trunk radios, but a cab driver company decided that their cousin could tweak their radio system and get more power and all this and that, and then even though it was not legal, they were still getting stomped on. In the offshore world, sit there and look at those supply ships with all the antennas sticking out of those places that are coming from all parts of the world, and sort of guess which frequencies they're operating in. And again, you just because you bought that spectrum doesn't necessarily mean that people aren't going to stomp on it.
And back to your point, it's also another reason why having a mesh network is important, so that you can route around the various frequencies and the various channels. And the nice thing is that you do have multiple channels too. It's not like it's one fat pipe, right? So if a part of your channel is blocked, you should have that agility to be able to move. And so again, it's about planning for what's going to happen in the future. And if you put in those kind of systems that are scalable, you should be okay. And there's advanced techniques as well that you can go and you can filter off and do all kinds of interesting things to help prevent yourselves just up front from being trampled on.
Okay, another question is there's one over here, Preet. It was an excellent question, by the way, Ed. Really appreciate it. Go ahead.
Don Gears with Mallinckrodt Pharmaceuticals. What challenges have you had were installing the radios and the wireless into electrically classified areas? Because we deal in a lot of Class 1, Division 1, and Division 2. I'd like to know your opinions on that.
The goods, well, if you look at it in the three ways, that framework in the wireless sensor networks, the good news is there's quite a bit of product that operates safely in the classified spaces. In the mobility world, I'd say our biggest challenge right now is getting Class 1, Dev 1, and Zone 1 mobile devices. The good news is there are things on the cusp that are, literally probably a couple weeks away from hitting the market, but that has been probably the biggest factors for acceptance of mobility within classified space.
And another reason why you shouldn't just run off to your access point vendor who's putting in stuff inside your carpeted space. So you've got specific products that have been developed and tested and deployed and used extensively in Class 1 Div 2 applications, and as Mr. Lafferty here is talking about, Div 1's very close to.
I would make a comment on that just to say that there certainly has been a lot of expansion, not in the handheld devices at this point, but in the infrastructure. There's certainly many products that have been developed over time. If you go back to a few years ago, there are very, very few. There's certainly a good deal more now. But it's still, for many suppliers, very much the exception in terms of the things that they supply versus the norm.
A major driver for going away from Wi-Fi and going to 4G is you minimize the amount of access points that you have to install in classified space. And the biggest cost factor in classified space is the installation of those access points. They can be up to $50,000 a point.
There's a question over. Oh, go ahead. And there's one over here to follow.
Mark Hosky with Control Engineering. Dave, you mentioned maybe monitoring would be easier to start with, and control is something you could consider later. Would the technologies differ for a 5-minute reporting system and a 5-second reporting system?
Generally not. It's more about size and scope. So in the case of like onshore unconventionals, you might be able to, you're going to have, your backhaul will have a limited bandwidth, typically. So what you want to look at is you need less of a backhaul pipe if you go to 5 minute, but the technology can be the same. It's just that you need less of it. there's also some technologies like 4G that, because of the battery life, it could do once a shift readings and it works well, but if it's once a minute, the battery won't last. So so the sampling rate can affect the technology also.
Also, just to spend a little bit more time on the data rates, I think that's the other key factor to look at, not just the sampling rates. So if you're looking at a bandwidth hog like video, you're probably not going to look at a sensor network type protocol for that. So, higher bandwidth generally means lower latency as well. So it's just another way of looking at your applications and deciding what's the right protocol to use based on that.
These gentlemen have a lot more experience with the technical side of things. From a practical standpoint, in our industry anyways, I think utilizing control systems is still a long way away. We're still trying to get people to accept monitoring. So I think we're a ways down the road before we're going to see control systems accepted to be used. First, we have to get a lot of experience with the monitoring side of things, and people just have generally with copper general more acceptance, and we've got a lot of history with it. So.
And certainly it's technically feasible. People are moving multi-ton cranes with wireless.
Sure, it's technically feasible. I think in our process in the chemical and petrochemical industry, getting people to accept that's going to take a little bit of time. So we're going to work more on the mobility side. You certainly should look forward and design the systems as much as you can, because control hopefully will come someday in those non-critical activities, but it's down the road a piece.
Okay, this gentleman over here had a question. Mike will get to you in just a second.
Ibrahim Hamad, Dolphin Energy Limited. As far as the ISA 100, the security architecture is extensively dependent on IT in terms of certificates, MAC address filtering, all of bits and pieces to secure the wireless communication. On top of it, you have encryption. So my question, does this security infrastructure being required for your wireless is managed by control systems or by IT or third party? And how often do you do security assessments of this? And the maintenance cost of it, does it really justify forgetting the idea of extending a cable or using a leased line or microwave, for example, or you find it really beneficial?
So from my view, and I didn't put this in my talk, the way we're organized for our wireless automation is up through our engineering group, not through our IT. There is some overlap and there's kind of a fuzzy boundary. I think that is the way that we're organized has helped us to accelerate the wireless applications being installed, rather up through our traditional IT systems that are putting a PC on our desk. And from my view, we of course have to test the system and we stress the systems from a security standpoint, and we do that on a regular basis. That's part of our protocol, and the systems have held up every time when we stress those from a security standpoint. So with a large site like ours is 400 acres, to cover that with wired, traditionally, and that's how we got it justified. We had the Department of Homeland Security come in and basically say we had to add some video cameras, and I kind of smiled because I knew right away that was going to help us go to wireless over the wired. So we looked at the cost difference, and there's no doubt that wireless video versus wired video is a much better way to go. And from a security standpoint, somebody can cut a wire to a wired camera, So, but we test them and we stress them, and we have a group in our engineering department that's their job, is to make sure that those systems can't be penetrated.
So at BP, what we found was the operations people didn't have the technical depth, and that the IT people didn't understand the problem because they were more carpeted space kind of people. So they actually created two organizations. One was called the Digital Security Group. They own the digital security for the entire corporation, regardless of what domain it sits in. So they have the ability to go in and force a chemical plant to update their firewall, even though they don't see a reason from a site perspective that they need to do that. So that's worked well. The other thing just recently is they've formed an organization called Operation Critical Telecom. And what they realized was that this whole area was in a gray area where neither group was well suited, and they've formed a new organization that helps bridge that gray area. And then now they're accountable for the delivery of these critical, telecoms and things like the, certificates and things like that.
Okay, this gentleman over here had a question.
Stephen Lovass from Danaher. Question for Chris. In the chart you showed where you were rolling out in different areas, wireless solutions, in the monitoring area, you had condition monitoring was circled, but tank management, leak detection, for example, weren't. So what drove you to condition monitoring over those other areas? And then secondly, was that replacement of existing monitoring, or were you enhancing a system?
So it was enhancing his existing system, and as far as why we prioritize that over leak detection and all that, it's really a matter of resources, and so we got together with the operations units and prioritized based on their input which one they wanted to do, and so. Again, we had to approach it from a safety and security standpoint. We wanted to approach it from that standpoint, and then working into the conditioning monitoring next. We'll be doing some leak detection as well. We'll be doing some tank monitoring as well. Like I said earlier, those have to be accepted. People just they're getting more. I would say that they're getting more comfortable with the tank monitoring, all that, and that concept as they get used to the fact that the wireless is fairly stable. But that'll be coming later. But it was just a matter of the resources that we had and talking to the needs in the business units and where they had a situation that they had to address.
Okay, one more. Go ahead.
Question, please. Just a question. You are free not to answer. Do you allow HMI wireless access? I mean, if somebody with a laptop or an iPad can wirelessly access your control system?
Not yet, no.
Other questions from the floor? I have a list of my own, so if somebody has one, it's probably better. These have all been excellent. Okay. Shamelessly, I will ask one then. Chris, you mentioned that BASF is starting to treat wireless infrastructure as a base cost. Can you expand on that a little bit? What's the scope of that, and how has that been implemented? And if I go to somebody and one of your German colleagues, are they going to really agree with that? I'm just wondering. I mean, how does that really work?
So here, what we did, and it's underway right now, so it's not proven. We've developed a standard that's been accepted in North America, and so now we have a North American standard. And what we're doing in the greenfield plants, and we've got a few on the drawing board, is when we're doing the estimation that those wireless infrastructures are part of the base costs. And incrementally, when you're talking multi-million-dollar investments, it doesn't get lost in the wash, but it certainly isn't going to make or break the economics of the project. So we haven't yet put a greenfield or new brownfield in. We've been mainly retrofitting the existing ones, but they are part of the estimates that we're putting together for the projects that are in the engineering design right now. And if you went to one of our German colleagues, I don't know if they're here right now, I don't know if they'd agree or not, but in North America, it's true.
Good. Okay, thanks very much. I'm sure that you're going to be leading them in that direction. Do you have a comment on that, Dave, in terms of your experience at BP? I was surprised to hear that from Chris.
The Alaska Business Unit at BP has adopted a thing called the Digital Umbrella, and the concept is that, again, it's almost that base cost because in the past, either operations paid for it or the resource people paid for it or the health and safety people paid for it. And it caused siloed systems because they called it their network, right? I pay for it, I get to use it. And but then also it didn't really leverage common infrastructure, common costs, and common, governance. So in addition to the financial aspect of it, it was just generating a lot of bad behavior. And so now they view the whole industrial wireless world as a complete system that is being delivered as a service for all the organizations.
Yeah, we're starting to see that, from several owner-operators right now. And as Chris was talking about, there's a lot of new projects coming up, especially on the Gulf Coast. A lot of these companies out there, petrochemical companies in particular, look at wireless as, hey, this is just another part of my project. And it saves a lot in terms of commissioning and pre-commissioning. And so even from a capital project perspective, there's tremendous savings, productivity-wise and time-wise. And then, of course, from an operational benefit, we talked a little bit about that. Chris's talked about that. Dave talked about that today as well. There's an ongoing benefit, too. So we're definitely starting to see a lot of that happen across several different companies at this time.
Okay.
Another great offset from that whole thing is that now it becomes a boardroom discussion.
Right.
And one point is to leave the alphabet soup at home and talk about the business case, because they could care less what all the gadgets are, but what's the end game. And so be careful about your conversation, because I've seen a lot of wireless programs not go anywhere because they fail to have the right conversation at that level.
Okay, is there a question over here?
About mobility, and your first driver was safety. I do think there's also challenges when you're mobile and have a device in front of you walking in the plant.
Yep.
How do you address that, and what do you do with that?
Well, I think that's just general behavior for us. It's about not multitasking, using the handrails. That's just a general safety behavior. It gets down to, don't use your cell phone and text at the same time while you're talking, and we actually have safety programs around that. We disagreed with the first AT&T commercials that came out when you say, hey, it's better to do multiple things at once. We didn't necessarily agree with that. We use that as an example of what we didn't want people to do. I think that's just general safety behavior. Certainly getting to the location and then using the device at that particular location, stopping, focusing on what you're doing, minimizing your exposure to risk, and that's the general safety culture that we try to engender at the site.
Probably the wearable devices also will really help with that, because there's issues with gloves and working at heights and things like that, where a tablet or handheld just doesn't make sense, and that we're thinking that wearable computers will really help with that.
There's a question over here. Oh, you got one over there? There's one, or this gentleman way in the corner. I guess he's going to keep you running from one side of the room to the other, Preet.
Dominic DeBello from Apex Tool Group. Question for you on your passive and active tags. Do you have any comments on the active and passive technologies?
That was Dave's comment, I think, or Dave's point at the end.
It's a blend, and I think it's more of, again, if we look at the Internet of Things, your traditional wired sensor was maybe $10,000 a point. Your wireless is around $1,000 a point. Now these passive sensors could be $10 a point. So now what you're going to see is this whole Internet of Things that we need to sort of prepare for from a management perspective, bandwidth perspective, that end-to-end solution, but also from an application perspective, we get more visibility into our equipment that which was never possible before. So so you look at people like GE, and they have a pretty active program in that space right now, because they see the potential.
And in terms of various tags that exist today, there's active and passive RFID tags, for example. Various companies have used them for different applications. Again, it's very much application driven. Both can be supported, are being supported on the same infrastructure. So it's really depends on what you want.
And then, yeah, and then, boy, it's almost a whole session on just asset tracking too. So it's really a blend of all those technologies.
Okay, other questions from the floor? I'm going to be a jerk and ask one more myself. Pardon me. But Chris, does every operator at BASF carry a brick radio out in the field? And if that's true, how do you think there are opportunities for converging that with your system, or have you looked at it? What's your evaluation of that?
Yeah, so as you saw on the list, operator mobility is not where we want it to be yet. It's probably the next thing that we're going to address, but we are concerned the fact that everybody does already carry a radio, and they're going to have to cinch their belt a little tighter by having things hanging from their sides. So it is an issue, and if we can get some devices that combine those capabilities for both the radio and some interface from an operator mobility standpoint, that's what we're looking at.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions? There's one more question from the floor. I think it's probably the last one we'll have time for.
So
Maybe
this
one
is
more.
just a observation to that. The brick radio, typically a Motorola, been around for years. It's there because of Class 1 Div 1 requirements for first responders, and knowing that no matter where you are in a facility, you don't have to worry. You don't have to pull out the electrical diagram that shows where the classification is to figure out whether or not you're in the right zone to use that device. And so many people are trying to use commercial off-the-shelf devices for communications and visualization, such as iPad, and so they slap something around it, and they say, okay, I'm Class 1 Div 2 certified now. But they forget to look on the Apple Store site at the specifications, and the upper limit is 95 degrees. That's the upper operating limit. That does you no good out in any sunlight at all for any length of time. So we have to look at industrialization of devices that give us the same type of accessibility as the ones that we're used to, but really work eventually in the Class 1 Div 1 environment. You agree?
I agree 100%, and it's not just that, Ed. I was smiling a little bit because I was talking with a food manufacturer recently, and their issue is not 95 degrees. Their issue is that they are always moving in and out of cold zones, and it just doesn't work with the commercial thing. So it's hot and cold and condensation and everything else. We do have time for one more if there's somebody else that has a question from the floor. If not, what I'd like to do is really thank these people for the excellent work that they did and the presentations that they did.